80% of people in ministry believe that ministry has negatively affected their marriage and families.
Wow.
And then 2 out of 5 pastors nationwide are seriously thinking about quitting the ministry. You got to go home first, and you got to solve that problem at home, and then you can do your ministry. But you got to solve that. You don't avoid home to build your ministry. You just got to realize that I am a human being. I am not the savior. I'm not Superman, any of those things. I'm a human that God's using.
If you have been listening to the Awesome Marriage Podcast for a while, you've probably heard Dr. Kim say to always put God first and your spouse second every day. But when your job is vocational ministry, it can be really tempting to put that ahead of your spouse since you're working for God. So today we're talking all about how to keep your marriage thriving when you're in ministry. It is your primary ministry after all. So Dr. Kim, first off, why does this topic matter? What's different in marriage for a couple that's in ministry?
Yeah, I'd heard a quote or somebody talk about marriage and ministry a couple months ago. So I started searching for that yesterday for that stat, and it was a survey that Barna did. And it's really interesting. 80% of people in ministry believe that ministry has negatively affected their marriage and families.
Wow.
And then 2 out of 5 pastors nationwide are seriously thinking about quitting the ministry. So I think there are some different things. And we've had this great resignation, after COVID in a lot of different areas, but we've certainly seen a lot in the church. So I think it matters. The topic matters because ministry is hard. It's demanding. There are expectations that are put on a couple and a pastor, whether it's the husband or the wife, that are a lot of times very unrealistic, but people think they're realistic. There's all the emotional demands that go on. If you think about what a pastor does, they do intervene crisis, grief, loss, conflicts, that all can, as they're draining yourself, pouring into people, it can take away from your marriage. And so I think a pastor in a church, and there's a lot of different ways people can be in ministry, certainly, but just as you look at the pastors, they are in the spotlight no matter what the size of the church. It's like they don't get, if they're outside the house, they're expected to always be on. And so I think that puts so much on a spouse, and I think it can definitely have a toll on the marriage. And I think I heard this, first time I heard it was years ago at a conference. I heard Josh McDowell talking to a group of pastors from around the world. And he said, your first ministry has to be your family, your spouse and your family. It has to be. And I think if you look at the Bible, that's what it says. It is God first, spouse second. And I think when you're in ministry, it's so hard to equate ministry with God. And I'm putting ministry first because, no, you're supposed to put God first, spouse second, and then your ministry. And I think it's easy to get that mixed up because you get pulled all the time in that. And you just don't have much left then to give to your family.
Yeah, that's so true. Man, those stats are really interesting. I'm kind of surprised that it was only 2 in 5 that are thinking about quitting at this point, honestly, because we've talked to so many people and it's just been so tough after COVID. A lot of things changing and a lot of burnout happening.
Well, I think just from what I see from that perspective, one, a lot of them really did survive through COVID, but it was so hard. And then doing church online, which churches did that they'd never done before. So you got to figure all that out and all those kind of things that went along with that. And then after COVID, everybody come back. No, they didn't all come back. And so then you've got, okay, how do we handle this? Does that affect our giving? Why aren't people coming back? And you start analyzing it and you can take it personally. So yeah, I can see, I'm kind of with you. It seems more like it would be more like maybe 3 out of 5 or more in that. But this survey was last year. So yeah. But I think that fact of how it affects the marriage, if you put on top of that this ministry is hurting my marriage and hurting my family, it kind of goes into, okay, should I get out of this thing?
That's really heavy. I mean, I was surprised it was 80% thought that ministries hurt their family and marriage. That's really tough.
And I think we'll go into some more things, but I think you got to take personal responsibility in it too. What are you not
Mm-hmm.
doing? And we're going to talk about some of those things,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a really high percentage to be across the board. I could
Yeah.
see somebody in a particular church saying, yeah, this is really hurting my marriage being in this church. They don't value marriage in that way. When I'm doing stuff
Mm-hmm.
with my family and marriage, they may not say something overt, but I get those looks, or I get those side comments, those kind of
Mm-hmm.
things. But for
Mm-hmm.
it to be across the board, it's pretty
Yeah.
big.
Well, one thing that I think about that why this topic matters, like why are marriages different in ministry? It's all people centric. So a lot of times in
Mm-hmm.
ministry, like one thing specific to COVID, I'll just say this so I don't get off topic, but specific to COVID, a lot of people, were not as in contact during COVID. Everyone was kind of trying to figure out how to respond personally or what to do. And so for our church, we experienced some people leaving our church because they didn't come to church. Some people left our church because they didn't like how we handled COVID. Some people
Yeah,
came to our church from other places because they really liked how we handled COVID. And we didn't realize until later that some people were considering that to be some sort of a political statement. And they thought that, that the handling of that era was politicized in some ways. So some people came expecting certain types of political alignment that we did not endorse or agree with or understand that we were implicitly communicating. So I'm just saying this because I'm guessing there's probably a lot of ministry couples who have experienced this in some way that the fallout was a lot different than what they expected. And so personally for ministry couples, you're building relationships with people in your church and then they disappear. They don't say anything. They just go
yeah,
away. And then new ones come in and the same thing happens again. They don't say anything. They just go away. Or maybe they say a lot of things and it's really tough and then they go away. All these things are really personally hurtful and draining. And so for ministry couples, I don't know what other kind of job you have where people can just kind of flit in and out without any sort of expectation. I mean, I think the healthy thing is to communicate with the pastor and church leadership if you're coming into a church or leaving a church. But I will say most people don't do that.
I bet that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And I think obviously the pastor's going to be aware of it. Maybe not
Mm-hmm.
somebody in some huge mega church or something, but most pastors are going to notice that.
Yeah.
And then how do you take that? If
Mm-hmm.
they haven't told you anything, I think it's easy in this era right now for pastors to take things personally and negative,
Mm-hmm.
just because of everything we've been through. And I think
Mm-hmm.
they've had to navigate something that we've never had to navigate before
Mm-hmm.
in our culture. And where
Yeah.
people still have the option of church online,
Yes.
which I'm so thankful we had it during COVID. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That made such a difference for so many people to stay connected. I can't imagine us going through that period of time without church online, where we
Mm-hmm.
couldn't be in churches for a period of time. But there's something about being in the building that you need to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think helping people, how do you help people value that again and see there's a difference when you are in that building and you're worshiping side by side with other people. And even if you don't have long conversations, you've got people and you're looking at them and you're saying hi and you're, a little bit, and you can stop and talk to people, which is harder to do. You can do it in a chat online, but still we need that face to face at time. And I think it's been hard. Nobody's come up with a magic formula to help people see, to value that in the way that I think most pastors would want it to be valued.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right. And I think it also, like, if people were a little bit on the fence about it to begin with, it's an easy jumping off point. But I think that too, there is an element of discomfort with being, shoulder to shoulder with other people, where it's definitely more comfortable to be home in your pajamas on your couch with your cup of coffee. And so I do think though that discomfort is part of what it takes to build relationships, like getting outside of your house, outside of potentially your comfort zone, and interacting with people. It's not easier, but I do think that that's a really important part of growth. That is part of why God has purposed the church to be part of a believer's faith walk.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, God did create the church and there was a reason for it. I know they didn't have church online back then, but
They did.
but there's value in that. Yeah. And I think that puts all those things that I think go together to make it hard to be a pastor in our culture today, for sure. I think it's always been hard in ways to be a pastor. Sure. Pastors that I worked with before COVID that had all kinds of issues too. But I think all of a sudden it's just been ramped up a little bit, maybe a lot because of COVID.
Yeah. That's for sure that's been a huge impact. So it's impossible not to talk about it. But I also think, I mean, I grew up with in a ministry family. My dad was a music minister my entire childhood and growing up years. And then I never ever ever planned to marry anybody in ministry. And after Brian and I got engaged, he said, "Yeah, I think I'm called to work in this college ministry." And I was like,
Did
"Okay,
you?
that's, he was volunteering. He started it as a volunteer,
Oh, so
and
that's
that was
okay.
fine. That was fine. And then after we've been married about a year, he got hired on staff, and gosh, did it spiral. And so now we planted a church about 10 years ago. So I'm a pastor's wife. But growing up in ministry, I did not want to be involved because you just knew everyone was watching you, and
Yes.
everyone was, I want to use the word judging, but I think they were actually. I think they were just kind of watching because, goodness, if a pastor's kid doesn't have it worked out, then who does? But we sure don't. We just don't.
No. I do think there's churches where kids feel that probably more than others, and that is a tough burden to lay on your kids. And that may go back to the whole this thing too, where a pastor says, I'm handling this fairly well, but my kids are drowning in this
Mm-hmm.
because of the church we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is. It's I think I heard that analogy years ago, but it's a fishbowl kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't be perfect kids. In fact, or you wouldn't be normal.
Right.
You know,
And I mean, I'll be honest, I wasn't even trying. I wasn't really interested. I was like, fine, you want to
yeah.
watch me? Then you can.
Then
And
go.
that's on you.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think that's probably you either go that way or you go the
Yeah.
other way, and you try to act so hard, and that is hard too because you're trying to be somebody you can't be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah, that's tough. And then in addition to that, I mean, you have, like you said, the unrealistic expectations people will have. People have just a tendency to put your ministers on a pedestal, which is not Christ. Like, it's not, there's no one exalted above another, but we're called to be above reproach, but that does not mean we belong on a pedestal.
right,
And in addition, one more thing is I just think that there's a relational sort of difficulty because with ministry, it does flow out of your character and out of who you are as a person. And so your community is wrapped up in that by default because you're going to be ministering to people in your church, relating with people in your church, building up that specific local church body. And so there's a type of relational buy-in required of ministry that I don't think exists unless you're an entrepreneur, maybe, or a founder. I think it's a heavy burden.
absolutely, absolutely. And you know this better, but you would think, okay, people come to this church, they like Brian, they come here, they all have the same expectations of him as a pastor, and that's not true, is it?
No.
So you get all these different things there that a pastor has to navigate,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know. I think it's sometimes hard to convince somebody that their expectation is unrealistic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then that gets it's just tough, and I think you're right. It's one of the tougher positions there is. The saving grace is that God put him there
Mm-hmm.
and put these people there,
Mm-hmm.
and that God does equip us. But that doesn't mean it's not hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things I've seen that I've loved about The Chosen is that the time that you see Jesus in it just really, really tired and really needing time with the Father, needing sleep, and making that very clear that we see that in his humanness. And I think that's I've just loved that because I guess it's something I always knew. You kind of read about those things in the Bible, but I think I can't think of the mention that portrays Jesus just such a good job of that. You can see in his countenance that he is just worn down and he needs that rest. And because people had all kinds of unrealistic expectations of him. I mean, he wasn't going to come in as a king, the kind of king they envisioned.
Right. Yeah.
So,
He definitely did not uphold those.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, I'll step away from the microphone because I could talk about this all day. So if we missed anything that's really heavy on your heart, email me. My email will be in the show notes because I know it's been heavy for a lot of us. But Dr. Kim, what are some common pitfalls you've seen ministry couples struggling with?
I think so. I think it's hard sometimes for some pastors to know it's okay to protect their marriage with their time, setting clear boundaries, managing other people's expectations, because I think the pastor has a role in that, and that is to if someone's unrealistic, to to let them know that. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's hard for some pastors to say no. I think it's hard for some of them to protect their spouse. Then not only we're talking expectations of the pastor, what are the expectations they have of the spouse? Well, the pastor we had before, I mean, she was always here and she made the best food for the potluck dinners and she did this and that. And your spouse may not know where the kitchen is,
Yeah.
and so how do you protect? How do you make those expectations realistic with your spouse, with your congregation for your spouse? And I think that's a pitfall that can come into. I think not ending the workday in a timely manner is
Mm-hmm.
one I see all the time. I mean, I've told people, I've said, set your watch, and if your quit time is 5 or 6, whatever it is, and that goes off, you get up and you walk out. I don't care what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
If
Mm-hmm.
you're on the phone, say, I got to go.
Mm-hmm.
Unless somebody's in a crisis or something. And then I think not finding that intentional time together,
Mm-hmm.
I see so much, and not praying together. I did a talk, this has been probably 10, 15 years ago now, to a group of pastors, probably about 50, 60 pastors. And one of the things I said, everybody in here that prays with your spouse on a regular basis, raise your hand. There
Mm-hmm.
wasn't one hand that went up. And
Mm.
that wasn't a catch you
Yeah.
question. It was like, I expected, see, well, now how do we get other people to do that? But no, it
Yeah.
was like they weren't. And so I think, and
Wow.
this is from a very different, people from different congregations, strong, Bible believing, all the
Mm-hmm.
things. So I think the pitfalls is a lot of it of just the things that we're not doing to
Mm-hmm.
protect our marriage, to setting boundaries, to being able to say no, to setting that side of time. I think on my calendar it says every day 30 minutes. It's on that calendar for Nancy.
Mm-hmm.
And I just hold that sacred. I don't book anything else in there. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that was a big step for me because it was easy to say, yeah, I'll go ahead and take one more
Mm-hmm.
client to see today just
Mm-hmm.
because I've got that time.
Yeah.
So I don't do that anymore. It's like, no, that's her time. And she expects me to walk in the door at that time. And that's when we spend our time together.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to begin to do some things like that. And it may make a few people upset, but
Mm-hmm.
hopefully they're going to see the value in that you're a better pastor
Mm-hmm.
because you're a better husband, because you're a better father, because you're taking the time to do those things.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, Dr. Kim, so when you did that, if you were to make the decision, no, I will not see that one more client because I'm going to see Nancy during that time, was there any sort of guilt with thinking, oh, this person might really need this session? It might really be something that, you know, that they need from me, and Nancy's okay. She can, she already knows everything's fine. Was there any of that involved?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was
Mm-hmm.
hard. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard. I say yes so easy. I say
Mm-hmm.
no so difficult.
Mm-hmm.
God's taught me a lot about that, the value in saying no.
Mm-hmm.
But that was hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing that helped me with that particular was to realize that Jesus said no. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't. He could have healed people 24/7 when he was
Yeah.
here, but he knew he had to say no at times. So
Yeah.
that helped me. So yeah, I think I guess where I came from, and if it was someone that was suicidal or somebody called me, I mean, an emergency,
Mm-hmm.
Nancy would understand, but that's got to be the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
And mine was being the rule
Mm-hmm.
of every week. Oh yeah, I'll just add that person in here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I had to realize that I've got another spot that week that person could come,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're really in God's hands, and there's other options for them too. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not the savior of the
Yeah.
world. I'm a
Yeah.
counselor that works these hours. And as long as I do that and keep my life balanced with the things that I do in my home life, I'm going to be much more effective. And if I start compromising those areas, I'm headed
Mm-hmm.
toward burnout probably. And I don't want to go
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And I love that you just said a word that I think we all need to hear, which is we're not the savior. Not a single
Yeah.
person in ministry is the one who's going to do the work of saving
No.
someone.
Somebody else is there too. God has more. He has called more people to marriage ministry than me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I love about what we do at Awesome Marriage is we're connecting with so many other people that
Mm-hmm.
love the Lord and love marriage and are trying to, God's using them in ways too. And it takes all of us working together. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
That's good. That's so good. One thing it makes me think of is when Brian was early in ministry, he worked in an organization that really glorified overwork and being busy and looking busy all the time, and that it was like an honor to be out 4 nights a week doing things, and that if you felt like it was too much, you should think differently because it's a privilege to be doing this work. And, we should be thankful to be part of it. That was really hard because he was kind of prone towards workaholism anyway. He likes to achieve, get
Sure.
things done. And that really got him, set off on that course. Have you seen that happen a lot with ministry?
I think so. Yeah, I think it. I think it is. It's like you are supposed to do this. Yeah, I think it happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there are. Yeah, I think there's some ministries that, and probably churches, denominations that lend themselves more to that than others. And so if you're in a organization like that or a church like that, it's going to be hard not to fall into that, because especially if you're someone, and I think most, I don't know for sure if this is true, I've never seen it, but I think most pastors are achievers. I mean, they're go-getters. They're there they have a passion about what they do. So it's really easy to justify those things.
Yeah.
And just fall into that trap.
Yeah. Yeah. So what can you do if that's your situation?
I think you can look at, is there something I can change either within myself or the organization? And it's also to give yourself, say, this may not be the place that I need to be, and pray about it and ask God to open other doors. And as I think, ask God, okay, guide me. How do I make it work here if that's where you want me? Or open a door so I know where you'd like me to go. Most of the time where I've worked with people in those situations, God's opened another door, because sometimes it's just really hard to change a culture. Even if God wants it changed, I mean, there's people in there and he gives us choices. And so sometimes I think that's really hard for that to happen.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great word too, because I think that sometimes it's really hard to see outside of that if you're in it and just think, well, I guess this is how ministry is, even though it's really draining. But it's not always like that.
We would, when I was first starting counseling and I was doing internships and stuff, and it was at a ministry called Scope Ministries in Oklahoma City, and they would have some people come in for like for a week at a time, things like that. And we had a lot of people came from different ministries that were close to burnout because of the culture that you're kind of talking about, that would just come there and spend a week or 2 weeks. Some of them end up staying longer than that just to get whole again, and to know if I'm going to go back, if God's sending me back into this, I got to have some tools to do things different. I've got to be able to set some boundaries and say no. And I didn't follow all those people at all, but I think they went back healthier, and hopefully they were able to set boundaries and that was respected. And so some of it is just like, if I'm going to stay here, I got to set some boundaries. I got to do something different. And if that doesn't work for them, I respect that. I know it, but no, can't do that.
Well, that's good. That's really good. So thinking of all those different things that we've talked about up to this point, how do they affect a marriage over time?
I think most of them are just kind of a gradual erosion or chipping away at. I don't think any of those are something that is going to be one way one day and one day the next day. I think it gradually does this. And so I think what happens, the more that happens, the less connection there is in marriage. We talk about connection a lot, and how essential it is to be connected in a marriage. Because if it's not, you're just kind of drifting along and you're kind of living strangers, all those kind of things. So I think if it's not marriage over ministry, then that's not going to work. And if you're like the bottom line, if marriage is not good, eventually your ministry is not good either. It's just not. And so I think it just gradually affects the marriage and affects the ministry, and neither one of those are good. All are both negative. And I just think that if your home life is not good and you're in ministry, eventually it's going to affect your ministry. I've seen it too many times.
Yeah, because the marriage is a covenantal relationship. The ministry is not.
Exactly. Exactly. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, going from that, I think hopefully most people are agreeing with that at this point when they're hearing you say that, and don't need to be convinced that their marriage is the most important thing. That is my hope and prayer.
Yes. And I think people struggle with that. I know that. And it goes back, I think, to expectations either that they or someone else has put on themselves.
Yeah.
And I think you just have to look at it. If you kind of just break it down practically, if if you're not in a healthy marriage, it's going to affect you, whether you're a pastor or wherever it is. There's studies that have been done on just the workforce in companies of people that have trouble with their marriage and how it affects their work life and their culture there. So I think it just makes sense logically that the importance of that relationship and that should be has to be taken care of.
Yes.
And then you're going to be more effective at really everything else you do.
Yes. Yeah. Because really, if you're not taking care of the marriage, there's something there that you're not dealing with. So if you're not dealing with things, then you're not growing as a person in the way that God would have you. And so that's going to block you and prevent you from, being the, fullness of who He's designed you to be.
Absolutely.
I do think it's important to mention too, while we're talking about this, I mean, it is easier probably to keep working than to spend time with your spouse.
Absolutely. And I think one of the hard things is, and maybe you're in a time where you're kind of struggling in your marriage, which we all go through. But if you're a pastor and everybody loves you and in everything you do, they think, oh my gosh, you're the most wonderful pastor I've ever known, stuff like that. Well, you're getting a lot of accolades there.
Yeah.
And that feels good. And if you're not getting it at home, because you got to get it at home first, those accolades and those kind of things, then it's really easy to continue to do that. Well, I can work here and these people think I'm great. I'm not going home.
Yeah.
I'm not going and fight tonight. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to schedule another Bible study for Thursday night so I can be out of the house one more night. Because these people are going to, afterwards, they're going to think I'm great. They're going to tell me that was the best Bible study they've ever been to.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some real challenges there of realizing, okay, you got to go home first. And you got to solve that problem at home, and then you can do your ministry. But you got to solve that. You don't avoid home to build your ministry.
Even if it is easier to be at Bible study than to help bathe the baby and read them the stories at bedtime.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that reminds me of this story, which I can share because it's published in a book. Paul David Tripp wrote it, and I just loved that he shared this. He shared about a time when I haven't read it in a while, so it might come out a little bit off, but he shared about, feeling unappreciated in his marriage and actually saying to his wife, don't you realize that 99% of women in our church would love to be married to me, and you're finding fault and picking on me? And she's like, excuse me, who are you married to? And I think he said that to say that was the extent of the pride he had gotten into.
Yeah.
And Brian and I always laugh about that example because it's like, man, that is so ridiculous. But who of us hasn't one time thought, everybody else seems to like me fine. Why do you not in our marriage?
Yeah. And it's got to be you, because all these other people can't be wrong.
Right.
What's wrong? Right. What's wrong with you? No, I think that's way too common. And it's easy to fall into that. Yeah. And it's just like, these people love me. Well, if people know you a little bit.
Right.
Your spouse knows you, hopefully, better than anybody else does.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Would any of those people live with you for a week and think the same thing?
Right. No. Yeah. Invite your spouse up to the stage next Sunday and let her tell all the things that bug her about you.
Oh, man. All right. So yeah, if you're looking at those 99% of people, you need to start looking in the mirror, because that is a validation problem we've got going on there. But also,
Well, I think it's for the enemy uses something that is really good, because you want to serve people and you want them to enjoy the Bible studies. Those are things that are not wrong. It's where you put that accolade in, so the enemy can use that against you. Well, this guy, I told you not to marry that woman. Or guy, and so now you know why. Well, you're stuck. You can't get a divorce, but you don't have to stay there. You don't have to develop that marriage. Just stay up here and talk to these people that are loving your Bible study. So it can be real tricky.
No doubt. He can twist anything, but especially things that matter.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so in light of all this, how can couples protect their marriage?
Well, when I've done talk a couple of times, and we have a course on how to marriage and ministry, and I mentioned 4 things in there that I think, as I was looking through some notes yesterday, that I think are really still true, that you can prepare. First one was your budget. Okay. Are your family needs taken care of? Do you have money in there to have time with your spouse, date nights, those kind of things? Are you willing? You tell everybody else that comes in that has trouble to go to counseling. Are you putting money aside, or would you put aside money if you guys need marriage counseling? And would you be willing to do that? I mentioned calendar. I think it's so important. On mine, it's times with Nancy, from date nights to lunch we do on Saturday to in the evening time, is on my calendar. And so you need to make sure that there is time for your spouse, and you got to hold that sacred. I mean, you just, unless, almost life and death thing, that's it. And you may say no to some people, you may tick off some people, but it's going to help your marriage. And honestly, if they don't like it, then your marriage comes first.
Yeah.
And then your thoughts. We did a podcast last time about how to encourage and support your spouse. Your thought life, is it positive? Are you thinking positive things about your spouse? And then your prayers. I think, are you praying for your spouse? Are you praying with your spouse? Are you praying that God help you to be a good spouse and to pursue them? So your budget, your calendar, your thoughts, and your prayers. I think all of those things together can protect your marriage, because you're doing in each one of those things that are healthy for your marriage relationship.
Yeah, those are good. Those are really good ones. And I like how practical they are.
Yeah, because I think it is. I think sometimes we want to make things too hard. And really, and I talk about it, is that marriage really, in rocket science, it's really just being consistent with the things that make a difference.
Yeah.
And so if you allow money for your family, if you set off time for your spouse, your calendar, you're thinking positive things, and you're praying for and with your spouse, man, do those day after day, and you're going to be in really good shape.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. So are there any specific boundaries for ministry couples that can help?
I think a couple's got to set aside a Sabbath for themselves, because everybody else that Sabbath is the day when you're working probably the most. And so I think that's really important to have that, and to hold that sacred, that this is a day that I don't schedule anything. This is a day that we have some time together. Those kind of things. I think that really helps. And because I think you see so many pastors that they're doing 7 days a week, and they do it over and over. And I think, well, I think next Monday I can take off. Oh no, I can't do it because somebody asks you to do something. Can I have lunch with you? Yeah, I'll have lunch with you. And then you just said yes to that person. You just said no to your spouse. And I think that's a good way to look at it. Anytime you say yes to one thing, you're probably saying no to something else. And a lot of times, if that's your spouse, it's not good. I think it's good to have a regular sign-off time from work, and overtime. Let people know, I'm going to leave the office at 5:30. I don't check anything. I'll check it at 9 before I go to bed. If it's an emergency, you can let someone know, and they'll get a hold of me. But other than that, I'm sign off. And so one thing that helped me a lot too was making that transition from the counseling center to home. And because of it, very easy to think about the people during the day. What am I going to do when they come next time they come in? And so I walk in the house and I'm still counseling mode. And so taking that time home and beginning to pray, leave each one of those people that I saw that day in God's hands, pray for them, and then beginning to say, okay, what's going to be like when I walk in, when the kids are home? What are they going to need? What's Nancy going to need when I get home? How do I just get engage with them? And it made a big difference, because then I walked in and I was home. I wasn't mixed with things I was still dealing with from the day, and then still trying to be a dad and a husband. And so I think that really helps. I think managing each other's expectations, other people's expectations of you, going back to when you're available. There's times that, if you set aside Thursday afternoon to do your final sermon prep or sermon prep, you've got to hold that sacred. You've got to. It's okay to do that. It's okay to say no to the person that wants to have lunch on that day or wants to drop by to talk about something. You can say things like, "Yeah, I really want to meet with you. I can't today. I can do that. Tell the other day you can do it." So you can learn to say things in a way that I think really helps.
Yes.
So I think that's good. Your days off, and really making sure that you take those days off. That you really. I think a lot of people in church just don't. They expect the pastor to be there all the time for them. No matter what, they don't really think about what's going on. So if you don't set the boundaries, they will.
Mm-hmm. I
And
think
so when
so.
someone asks you, can we meet, that you don't have to say yes.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't really have to say why. You can just
Mm-hmm.
say, I can't do that. I'll give that option. I can't do that, but I can
Mm-hmm.
do this. They don't have to know that you're going to the movie with your wife
Mm-hmm.
that afternoon, because this is a show that your wife has been waiting on to come and wanted to share it with you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if they ask why, you can say you've got a previous commitment,
Mm-hmm.
which you do.
Mm-hmm.
A previous commitment, it could be you're just chilling with your wife watching Netflix. But you know
Mm-hmm.
what? It's okay. Your marriage has to be a priority, and so does your time for rest. And I think you have to do that. And getting to where you don't feel bad about saying no is really important, because ministry really is kind of a marathon in
It
so
is,
many
yeah.
ways. It's just, you're always sprinting.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't stop and do the things we're talking about, you're going to burn out.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to say no to things now so you can make it the long haul.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go strong for 7 years of ministry and you have burned yourself out, you may never get back in ministry again. Now,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean God can't use you in some other things. I'm not saying that. But if you take care of yourself, you can continue healthier for a much longer time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the other thing I think happens is uh, deciding that when you make a decision, what's the good thing and what's the best thing? Because a lot of times we need to say no to good things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, some pastors saying, well, no, I'm going to go home and not go to the strip club with the guys. Of
Right.
course,
Right.
it's not that. It's usually I can spend time with this person or do premarital counseling with this person, but you can reschedule those. And if it's interfering with the best thing, and that's time with your spouse, if you're having dinner with somebody in your congregation, it might be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But having dinner with your spouse because she fixed something special that night
Mm-hmm.
is the best thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's being able to look at things more objectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that people that get unhappy about your boundaries is usually people just want to overstep boundaries, and they're
Yeah.
probably overstepping yours and everybody else that's in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean you need to change those boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So, for each one, what do you need to do? What are the things you can do there? How do you say no? How do you take time to take care of yourself, and making sure you do all those things?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you'll find, definitely your marriage is going to be better, but I think your ministry is going to be better too.
Yeah.
Putting
Yeah.
in more time doesn't always make you a better pastor or a better preacher or, deliver a better message.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't, because if you're up there and you are drained and you're stressed
Mm-hmm.
and you haven't, our homes and our marriage should be that place where we rejuvenate ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we are in a rough position, like maybe as a pastor or other things that are hard, when we walk outside that door, that's got to be your refuge. And if you
Yeah.
don't let that be your refuge and your place to recharge and to be loved and cared for and let your hair down, you need that. And you just need to have it.
Yeah. Yeah, because like you're saying, having that time, spending more time is not going to make you a better pastor. It's also not going to produce more fruit in people's lives. It's not going to bring more people to Jesus. It's not going to make them happier.
No.
It's not.
No, and I think that's such a good point of just, not fooling yourself
Mm-hmm.
in those things, not because I think that's where the enemy does some subtle things again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you aren't supposed to save a few more people than you're
Mm-hmm.
saving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you work a little harder when you do that, because Satan wants you to burn out, so he didn't have to deal with you in ministry anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know, Brian's probably had to deal with all those kind of things as being a pastor over the years.
Yes. Yes. All of it. All of it. And I think it was like, a lot of it when we planted the church, it felt like a sprint at first. But when you think about it, it's really more of a marathon, like you said. And so I think one tip that I would say for boundaries is just reassessing things. We've had to reassess things like having a Sabbath day has always been really important to us. My parents modeled that really well. They always took Fridays off. And so we've done that, but then we've had to kind of readjust how we do it practically in different seasons of life and in different, situations. And so I think reassessing your boundaries, figuring out how many nights a week is okay to spend out. And that changes in seasons too. Sometimes, this semester, because we had our first child going to graduate from high school, I just said, I'm not doing anything. Well, that's not actually true. I lead worship. So I have a night a week that I'm at rehearsal. And that's been something I've done forever. Not every single week, but when I'm on the schedule. And that Sunday I'll be on. But I said, that's all I can manage this semester. And that was a big step for us. And it was for sure the right step because we didn't know, how that would play out for us. And even just for me personally, the emotional burden of that season, I didn't want
Hmm.
to, I didn't want to come into like something else feeling like I needed to get something from it that it can't give me, or like I need
Hmm.
to provide something there that I can't give. And so those for me are big signals that like if I'm personally, like trying to take more or trying to give more than is possible, that maybe I don't need to do that thing in that season.
Yeah, that's good. That was a great example of something that you prioritized because
Mm-hmm.
you felt like that was the right thing to do. That's
Mm-hmm.
something you wanted to do and need to do, and you were willing. Did you get any pushback from anybody?
There's always a couple people who make a little snarky comment and be like,
Yeah,
oh, you don't have to go, or whatever dumb thing people say. But I've just kind of learned that's really on them. That's their perspective coming out. I don't take it personally anymore.
exactly. And I think that's kind of where you have to go. You got to just
Mm-hmm.
when those things happen, just give that to God
Mm-hmm.
and not let it stick. Because
Mm-hmm.
they don't define you.
No.
God defines you, and God wanted you to be the wife, the mother that He put you in that position to be, and
Mm-hmm.
that all comes first.
Yes.
But yeah, I think the hardest ones are the snide comments
Yeah.
because you just it's like I don't
Yeah,
like that.
I really do think though that the Lord has just showed me in the past. I mean, maybe it's even more since COVID, but just seeing how people will say those things because they're not at peace inside of themselves, and
Exactly.
that's it makes me sad for them, but I can't do
No.
anything about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So those are some specific boundaries for couples. What about for individuals? What are some steps individuals can take?
Um, I think just taking care of yourself. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so having healthy boundaries, obviously, thinking those through,
Mm-hmm.
having an exercise plan. I think
Mm-hmm.
that is so important, and I see a difference in people in ministry that do and don't over
Mm-hmm.
time. Making sure you have that time alone with God and His Word,
Mm-hmm.
whenever that is, and it's not sermon prep. It's got to be
Mm-hmm.
separate from that because I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of pastors want, well, I mean, I spent 3 hours preparing my sermon this week. Now, I think you have to have that alone time with just you and God. And then make sure you've got regular time set aside to invest in your marriage. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not just to sit on the couch together watching the same thing, which there's nothing wrong with that, but you got to
Mm-hmm.
do other things too.
Yeah.
And then, and I think too, making time to be in fellowship with other people in ministry, other people or other, uh, just to have fellowship time. I think
Mm-hmm.
guys need that. And we're talking guys, there's a lot of women pastors. And I think all this applies to them. Same with just a little quirk because being a mom too adds another thing for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
them that they have to deal with. But I think being around others in ministry, I know some pastors that have done that. And, there's a pastor group that I knew of. It's probably been 7 or 8 years ago. And if they still meet, nobody really, they didn't talk about it much, but they were from 5 different denominations that don't agree on everything,
Mm-hmm.
but they met together for lunch, I think every 2 weeks. And it was
Mm-hmm.
so good for them because they shared and they talked and they weren't really, they got past doctrine
Mm-hmm.
to the heart of what ministry really is and how do I do ministry well and have the marriage and family that I want. And
Mm-hmm.
it, I think having others in that to talk through things like that are really important. And so I think if you're in ministry, don't be afraid to grab somebody else. And you may want to grab somebody else that's not, maybe you're a pastor, maybe you grab somebody that's in Young Life or Campus Crusade or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. That's because everybody in ministry has their own struggles with
Yeah.
that and spend some time together, encouraging each other, praying for each other. I think those are really helpful too.
Those
So
are
those are
so
kind of the
good.
things I think would really make a difference.
Yeah, I think so too. I agree. And I would have shouted that same concept of having other ministry friends who are from different contexts. That's something that's been really life-giving for both of us is for Brian, I guess I had a few guys who knew each other who were all for the most part either campus ministry or church plant
Hmm.
and then they started getting together, and then all of their wives, we were like, wait, no, we want to do that too. So we started meeting separately on our own. And there's just something about that shared experience that
Yeah.
everyone really understands when you say something about what you've gone through that you can't tell any other person who's not in ministry because you just know they won't understand. But these
Yeah.
people do. They do.
Yes.
It's huge.
I think it's so important. And I know for some people it's kind of hard to take that step, but I would encourage you to take it. I don't think you'll ever regret that.
Yes. And I think too, I think if you're in a place in a church context where some churches kind of have a feeling that other churches are maybe like a rival church. Maybe I've heard people say this
competition.
Like, yes, I've heard people in my church verbalize that. Oh, you're hanging out with the competition. No, these are our teammates. We are on the same team.
Yes. I think it's the same thing like with marriage ministry. You know, we're not at odds with exo marriage or expedition marriage. No, we encourage them and they encourage us to continue to do the work together.
Yeah.
But also they understand some of the things that we struggle with. And so just like other people in, other ministries they're going to understand.
Yes.
And that makes so much difference because none of us like to feel like we're alone or feel like we're the only one that's dealing with this. And I don't think we're ever the only one dealing with something. Somebody else has or is or will be.
I think so. I think that's one of Satan's biggest lies is that you're the only one, and it's not true. So if you haven't found those people yet, start praying about that, start reaching out. Just because you meet once doesn't mean you have to meet forever, but you can, if you love it, you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think I've talked to some people that I think really did that well. We're blaming everything on COVID, but quit during COVID and haven't picked it back up. And I've encouraged them to, hey, are you still meeting? No, we can't quit during COVID. But I said, I bet they'd like to get together again.
Yeah.
And get that started again.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's not too late.
Nope.
You can start back right now. One other thing I've done personally is, like you're talking about getting exercise routine. I've done that forever, but I always exercised alone. And so one thing I changed in the past couple of years was getting people to exercise with. So I meet with a whole group. It's a team that I'm now part of. And it has been so good to get around people who are not at all related to church. They don't know me in that context or that role. They just know me. And so that's refreshing. And I've enjoyed that more than I expected.
That's great. Yeah, that's good. And I think, and you can look for those opportunities to connect. Some people like to work out alone just because they think and, process or listen to things. And so that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's also the opportunity, looking for those opportunities to connect with other people. And I love what you said about being in a situation where nobody looks at you. There's a pastor's life, so you can just do things a little different. We had in our small group a few years ago, we had a pastor and his wife that joined it. And they said, I don't know how many times they thanked us for we can be ourselves here. You're not looking at us as pastor so-and-so. You're looking at us as who they are. And that was, I think it was real valuable for them.
Yeah.
And they felt we were a safe place for them and they could talk about things. And so that's really good.
So valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we're starting to wrap up, let's talk briefly about burnout. You've mentioned it a little earlier. So what are signs and symptoms of that?
Yeah, I think it's been on my mind a lot. Our friend Kerry Newhoff and I listened to Kerry and talked to him, but he said something not too long ago that I thought, and I may get the quote a little bit wrong, but he said, we're nearing the point in the church where if we don't take pastoral health care seriously, our health or our ill health will take us. And I think with all the things we've talked about that pastors go through and the stress and everything, I think that's true. So signs of it, definitely if you're feeling stressed, if depression, you can go online and take a quick depression inventory. If you're honest, it shows you're depressed, then you're depressed. Insufficient sleep and rest. I think sometimes we think we're supermen and I can get by with 4 hours sleep. There's nobody, I think, but Casey Neusett that I know of that can get by with 4 hours sleep because he talks about it and he tries to get everybody to do that. And we can't. He's maybe the one or a few people that are wired to where they can do that. Most of us can't. And you've got to have good sleep and rest. Spiritual dryness. It's like, okay, we all have dry times. I get that, but that's where it's going over and over. And then your motivation's not there. Man, you sit down to write your message, or you feel like I've got the board meeting, or I've got this meeting, or that kind of thing, and you just don't have the motivation. If you're feeling isolated or isolating yourself, I think that's a sign of it. And I think if you see that, I'm more susceptible now to temptation than I used to be. we're all tempted, but I think we know when we're more susceptible than others, and then just disengaged and just where just your pastor say, "I love you guys, I love your," and you're just thinking, "Man, I'm saying that, but I don't love any of these people that I'm
Mm-hmm.
serving right now." So I think it's just when you just change the way you look at things. You're worn down, you're stressed, you're depressed, you're not sleeping good. Your time with the Lord is not good. It's just dry, and then you just kind of withdraw, and you just don't have that motivation that you are either there or headed toward burnout, and you need to do something about it.
So what do they need to do?
When I'd go to a counselor first. I would talk to somebody that's objective, that can kind of help you assess where you really are. Your doctor may be able to do that too, your medical doctor, if you have a good relationship with your medical doctor. And then make a plan. And it may mean you need a sabbatical. And if you're in a church, you talk to those who are in leadership and say, "Man, this is where I am, this is where I'm going. I've got to have a sabbatical. I've got to do this different." And if they support you in that, that's great. If they don't, it may mean that you have to leave and go somewhere else. And I know that's scary, but if you don't, you're going to crash. And there's all kinds of stories. Kerry Newhoff has a great story of his burnout, and how he handled it in a good way, that now he's got a different type of ministry that's thriving. So sometimes God will use that to say, as we heal through this burnout, I'm going to take you over here now. I think this is where I want you to be. I know this is where I want you to be now. So I think you just got to be honest with yourself about it. Most of the guys that I see, and I see much more men than women in burnout. I don't know why. I just thought about that then when I said it. But I think you got to be honest with yourself, and you just got to realize that I am a human being. I am not the savior. I'm not Superman, any of those things. I'm a human that God's using.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if Jesus had to take time to rest, why do we think we don't?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good. And also, just to make aware, there are sabbatical coaches. There are people out there who will help you kind of bridge that gap. They can provide education for the other staffers at the church or organization about what sabbatical is, what it's for. It is not a leave of absence. It's not because you're in trouble.
Right.
And so there's a lot of helpful resources. If you didn't know that, start looking these things up because it exists. There are great ministries that are offering pastoral health counseling and mentorship. And that's one thing that really helped Brian recovering from workaholism and learning how to rest. I mean, because if you don't know how, it's really scary to think about like trying to break that addiction to work. If you don't know how. So there's resources out there. Start checking it out because there's really good stuff. Check out emotionallyhealthydiscipleship.org. They have incredible resources. I'll put that in the show notes because it really does all stem back to this. If your core, if your heart, your soul is not healthy, that's going to spill over into your marriage, your ministry, everything you do. And so we have to follow Jesus's model and not try to outwork him.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I can't think of the name. You may know, I know places where you can go and you and your spouse can go and live for a period of time and learn the things that you're talking about. Rest, relax, and learn what I need to do to get healthy again and keep from getting this situation again. So you're right. There's a lot of resources out there. And so I think if you're feeling that, don't feel like you're alone. You may want to start with your counselor or your doctor, but look for these other resources too, and take advantage of all those things.
Yeah. So Dr. Kim, this has been a really helpful and practical conversation. Do you have any final piece of advice for us today?
Well, I think we've talked about a lot. I think what I want people to hear is that ministry is not easy, and I think it's really tough in the culture we're in right now. But God always has answers, and I think if we take care of ourselves, we take care of our marriage, God's going to take care of us. I don't know exactly what that looks like for everyone, but obedience to what He's called you to, I think, is important. But He didn't put it above your marriage, and He didn't put it above your relationship with Him. And I think sometimes people get there that the church really is first, not God. And so I think we've got to keep things in order, and we've got to take care of ourselves, and we need to connect with other people that are in the same boats that we are, so we can paddle together.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's so good. It's a great place to wrap up today. As we wrap up, I want to remind you to check out the Sustaining Your Marriage in Ministry course that Dr. Kim referred to earlier and that you heard about in this episode. You can find that in the Awesome Marriage University on our website or in today's show notes. Next week on the podcast, we're going to be sharing advice and encouragement for healing after betrayal with our special guests, Ryan and Jessica McDaniel. So make sure you tune in next week if that's a situation that has been part of your marriage. Thanks for joining us today on the podcast. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.